Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy for the COVID-19 economy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. Our guest today is Elaine Maag, a principal research associate here at the Tax Policy Center. Elaine is one of the nation's leading experts in government support programs for people with low incomes, and especially the use of the tax code to assist these households. We'll be discussing the major changes in the child tax credit and other provisions included in the American Rescue Plan. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This event's being recorded and will be posted online on TPC's website in the near future. Also want to let you know that this webcast is going to be using captions, and you can adjust or hide them with the live transcript button that's at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for the prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Elaine Maag, welcome to the prescription.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So the American Rescue Plan, which was signed last week by President Biden, made a number of important but temporary changes in the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and other refundable credits that mostly benefit low and moderate income households. Let's unpack these, starting with the enhancements to the CTC. Very briefly, what changes did the law make?
So the law made 3 changes that change how we calculate the credit and 1 change about how we deliver it. First change it made is it now includes 17-year-olds. So prior to this, you had to be under 17 to qualify for the credit. Now you can be age 17 and qualify. The credit was also increased. It had a maximum value of $2,000, and now it can be up to $3,600 if your child is under age 6, or $3,000 if your child is age 6 to 17. And the most important change in how you calculate the credit for low-income families is that the credit was made fully refundable. That is, you no longer have to earn any amount of money before you're fully eligible for the credit. The fourth change is one that's administratively very important too, in that the IRS will attempt to deliver the credit throughout the year, starting in July, rather than receiving it only at tax time as a tax refund.
Great. So let's unpack each of these. Let's start with size. So at least for 2021, the credit's substantially bigger than it was before. And this continues a trend that's been going on actually for several years. But is this just a more generous credit, or is it somehow qualitatively different from the earlier versions?
It's definitely a more generous credit. It's almost doubles the amount of benefits that will go out through the child tax credit, but it's really different too. Always before in the tax system, to get a benefit, you needed to be working. And to get this particular benefit, you had to earn at least $2,500. And then your benefit was even capped further. You could only get $1,400 as a tax refund. These are extraordinarily large changes for low-income families now to have access to that full $3,600 or $3,000. And just to give you a sense of scale, Tax Policy Center had calculated previously that there were 27 million children living in families that didn't get the full $2,000 credit simply because their family didn't earn enough money.
And according to some estimates, I guess this will take half of children who are now in poverty out of poverty. Is that right?
So together with the rest of the rescue package, we expect child poverty to be roughly cut in half. So there's about 10 million children who we estimated would be in poverty in 2021, and now that number is down closer to 5 million.
So let's talk a little bit more about this full refundability. Why is it so important to these families, these very low-income families?
So low-income families face a multitude of problems, and it's difficult to solve each of these problems with a different program. So food insecurity, for example, there's roughly a quarter of families who report that they're not eating enough or not eating balanced meals simply because there's not enough money in the household. Those numbers are higher if you're Black or Hispanic, about 4 in 10 families. Rent relief, you've heard a lot about that lately. There's many people who are behind in rent, roughly triple the number as is normally the case. And so our past approach has been, we'll solve these problems one by one. We'll create a food stamps program, and that'll help with food insecurity. And we'll create a rent relief program, and that will help renters. And maybe we'll throw in some transportation subsidies for people who have difficulty getting to work. And it turns out this is very confusing and creates a web of programs that's difficult to administer and difficult to figure out you're eligible for and benefit from. So there's sort of a new game in town where folks say, the core problem is people don't have enough money. So is there a way we could get just cash into people's households and then they can solve their own problems? And we see lots of little demonstrations of this throughout the country, more basic income style, but this would be focused on just children here in the United States. So they took an existing tool, they said, here's a tool, it delivers benefits to 90% of kids already. The kids being left out are largely very low income kids. What can we do to change the credit so that those very low income children get full access to the credit? And that's what they've done.
So more broadly, this raises an interesting question. Some critics of cash benefits have said that if you give cash to low-income people, they will misspend it. They'll really not spend it on those things that are most important. But I understand there's actually research out there that suggests that when you give cash to people, they actually spend it very well. What's the real story?
So there's definitely research that suggests, particularly when you label something a child benefit, that it gets spent on children. People buy more after school enrichment programs, people buy better childcare, people buy food. Now, that's not to say when this rolls out, there will be horrible stories about cash coming into people's house and it being misspent. And what I always think people need to do is you have to balance potentially giving some money to someone you might classify as undeserving to precluding someone from getting money who we would all agree would use this money and needs this money. And you have to balance that, potential downside to the possible upside of lifting so many children from poverty. The research here is crystal clear that low income children, and they face sort of a lifetime of problems because of being low income as children. It's a policy and a problem that's worth addressing.
So one of the other changes you mentioned is that the eligibility age is raised. So why do that? What's the logic behind that decision?
It's unclear to pretty much any researcher why the age was capped at under 17 in the first place. The best guess is it was simply a relic of a budget. We had a certain amount of money to spend. We wanted to give a round benefit, and that worked out to be kids under 17. It was just never addressed. What that meant was you have children who, um, you qualify for different tax benefits at different ages, and it makes taxes more confusing for people because a child is not a child depending on what benefit you're talking about. So including that extra year allows the definition to become at least closer to what we think of as a child, sort of that under 18 group of people.
So another big change you mentioned is making the credit advanceable so that families don't have to wait until they file their tax returns in the spring to get a payment. So Congress is a little vague about how this would work. And there are questions about the ability of the IRS to actually manage the effort. How do you think this is all going to play out?
I think it's a very tall ask from the IRS, and there's a lot of political pressure to deliver those payments monthly. Start them in July, pay them through December, and then you'll get the rest of your credit when you file your tax return. That said, the IRS is a constrained agency. They have a certain budget they work under, they have a certain staff, they have a certain computer system. So they're going to have to work incredibly hard to make those monthly payments happen. So the final legislation does give a little flexibility. And what we might see is 2 quarterly payments instead of 6 monthly payments. It'll still represent an advance for families. They'll still see this benefit very visibly before tax time, but it might not be, look like what we thought it would coming out of the House.
So it's interesting. This has been an interesting contrast between public policy people who have argued for a long time that when you have cash constrained families, it's better to get them income on a regular basis. And the desires of many of the families who seem to really like the idea of getting a big refund once a year. So how do you think about this? Who's right? I mean, are the economists actually trying to tell people to do something they don't want to do?
There was excellent research that came out when the only refundable tax credit that was of any size was the earned income tax credit. And at that point, people did like getting their large refunds. In fact, we had an advance option and very few people took advantage of it. They liked getting those large refunds because it allowed them to invest in a large item, a refrigerator, a used car. Maybe you could get first and last month's rent together and move into new housing. So these lump sum payments were extraordinarily important. Over time, when we had that system, we also had a robust cash transfer program in the safety net. We had other supports that sort of helped people out month by month. Since then, the safety net has been decimated. There's almost no cash benefits being delivered through what's now called temporary assistance for needy families. And instead, the tax piece has grown. The earned income tax credit has grown multiple times. The child tax credit has gotten bigger. And so what we've done is we went from a program where you had some regular support available and then this big tax benefit to now you really only have this big tax benefit. And I think that's a disservice to people. So there's been subsequent research where small demonstrations where the researchers tried to deliver the payments in advance, typically quarterly. And at the end of those experiments, you hear people say things like, it allowed me to not get behind on my bills. It allowed me to meet my needs as they come up. I was able to go to the doctor when I needed to rather than waiting for my tax refund. And many of them will also say, I would like to see my credits delivered throughout the year. By advancing the child tax credit, we sort of are trying to get the best of both worlds. We get that regular support into households, and then we give that earned income tax credit for low-income families will still be coming at one time. There's also the IRS, among the many things it's directed to do in that legislation, they are supposed to set up a portal where you could actually opt out of these advanced payments. So there will be some safety for people who really don't want to see them come as monthly payments.
Would you, in a perfect world, make all the refundable credits advanceable?
That's an interesting question. I do think there's value in receiving that large tax payment. And I would like to see low-income families have the same flexibility that high-income families do. So I can actually over withhold throughout the year and make it so I get that big tax refund. And because I work at Tax Policy Center, I have a pretty good sense of how big that refund is going to be, and I can call it my vacation fund. Low-income families don't have that option right now. If you're not being withheld, which is the case for many very low-income families, you're sort of stuck getting this lump sum payment. So if we could make it so you could get these benefits throughout the year or at one time for all families, I would very much like that. I do think there's always going to be a place for that lump sum. Everyone loves getting a tax refund. It's just across the income distribution, we see large tax refunds largely because people have set their finances up to receive them.
So as much as economists tell people you shouldn't love it, people love it. So let's talk a little bit more about who will distribute this. So Mitt Romney has proposed his own children's allowance. There's a lot of differences between his proposal and what's in the American Rescue Plan. But I want to focus on just this one. He'd have the Social Security Administration distribute the funds. And at first glance, it seems like a good idea since sending monthly checks is what the Social Security Administration does, and it's not something the IRS normally does. So who do you think would be better at this?
Long term, I like the idea of this benefit going into an agency that's either Social Security or like Social Security, that's mission is to deliver checks to a defined group of people, and they don't have to worry about, all of the things the IRS has to worry about. But to turn a program on a dime, which is essentially what the Congress is asking to be done right now, the Social Security Administration is totally unsuited to do this. They have the Social Security numbers of almost all children, so they know they exist. IRS has that same information that Social Security shares with them. Social Security has no clue where most children are living. So the IRS knows where you lived when you filed your 2020 tax return, when you got your economic impact payments that have been sent out. There have been a lot of corrections in the data from that. So they have a good sense of where children are living. And the SSA just does not have that information right now. And as you know, children are born, they get a number. They don't get a bank account that's attached to that number. So SSA would need to collect all of this information on where to send the payment. Long term, I think it's an attractive option. Today, it's not doable.
So you'd usually start with the IRS and then see how it goes.
I would if you have to do it so quickly. Now, if Congress said, I'm going to give you 5 years to stand up this program, then I would happily go over to Mitt Romney's staff and I would say, let's work. What makes this attractive to you? This is what makes it attractive to the tax people. And let's figure this out, how we can best serve the families we're most worried about.
But I guess that train's left the station. They've got to deliver this by July, not in 5 years. So that's not going to quite work. Uh, and you pointed out, I think, the other issue about making these credits advanceable, which is going to be a challenge, is that the lives of young families change a lot during the course of the year. Babies are born, people age to a lower credit, they age out of the credit. It's going to be very complicated, it seems, for everybody to keep track of all this. How's that going to work?
Yeah, one of the downsides of administering a benefit through the income tax system is that it's a very blunt instrument. And one of the ways it's blunt is that we look at eligibility on an annual basis. And that is exactly what you're talking about causes troubles. So something like 40% of children are born outside of marriage today. So in some cases, those are cohabiting couples, but that's two tax units. Children are moving between homes because of divorce. I did work with Liz Peters earlier on this, and it's a larger issue for lower income families than higher income families. So what we see is a lot of movement happening, and that's exactly right. Who gets the benefit? Well, right now, you wait until the end of the year and you look back and try to figure out who did my child live with more, and that's generally the person that will receive the benefit. This is asking people to sort of guess, and even worse, it's asking the IRS to guess where those children will be and start sending out payments. Now, the portal that I described is also supposed to allow you to update your information. So hopefully if your child is not on your tax return this year, but you are taking care of them, you'll go in and update that information so the payment will be delivered properly. But I think that will be a huge challenge for the IRS. My solution, which will cause like every administrator at IRS to begin to weep, is that we figure out how to actually split up this benefit across tax units. I don't expect them to do that this year. It would not be legal this year. There'd be important legislation. But ultimately, I think that's what we need to do. And that's sort of why SSA is attractive, right? If you have a child who receives SSI right now and the child switches caregivers, that payment just moves right with the child. And that's what we would like to see with a child benefit, I think, as well.
So we got an interesting question from one of our audience, which is what can be done to provide benefits to families who are homeless and who lack bank accounts? Is there
I
some
get
way
this,
to get the money to them?
yeah, I get this a question a lot. And what I want to say is it's crystal clear in the legislation that the intent is that people without homes are eligible for these benefits. There's no question about that. And unfortunately, what happens is the IRS is able to send paper checks. So if you can get an address to send a paper check, I spent a long time volunteering at a homeless shelter in Washington, D.C., and we provided addresses for people that were temporarily, lacking stable housing. You might have a relative that payment can be sent to. I know these are all second best options. I would like someone to just walk up to an IRS window and say, here's my number. Can you please deliver the payment I am owed? That option does not exist. You have to find a place that the IRS can send it to, and you can update your information through this portal that's being sent out. And hopefully, people are filing a tax return right now so that the IRS can use that 2020 information to get you payments, starting later this year.
Of course, one of the challenges too, if you're unbanked, is if you have to go to a liquor store or somewhere else to cash a check, the fees can be pretty significant, and there are other issues there as well.
It's extraordinary. It's very expensive to be low income. Nothing is simple. The services tend to be worse. They tend to be more expensive. The providers, the check cashers would say they're at higher risk with this client, but these are government checks by the IRS. They don't bounce. There's no reason that there should be these usurious fees on this type of check. Unfortunately, that is the case for low income families.
So as we discussed, the TCJA also expanded the size of the credit, but it made families making as much as $400,000 eligible for some credit amount. The enhanced credit, which was just enacted, phases out much sooner, but couples making 160,000 still benefit. What's the justification for giving a credit to families with incomes of $400,000 or even $160,000?
In the tax system, we've always had this notion that if you are a larger family at the same income as a smaller family, you have less ability to pay tax. And so there's been an adjustment for family size. It used to be a dependent exemption. In the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, one of the things that I actually think that was good about the act is that it consolidated essentially this dependent exemption and the child tax credit into one benefit. So there's still some notion that we should be adjusting taxes or how much tax you pay based on family size. And that's what the credit does for higher income families. When we think about targeting this additional payment, I think it's a really tough question. You are going to miss people that are hurting if you get too clever and cut the line too low. And then you risk, of course, including people that you don't think need to be included when you make the line too high. And a lot of this is geographic variation. When I'm in my home state of Kansas, the incomes where these are phasing out seem extraordinary. I could buy any house I wanted on that kind of income. Living in Arlington, Virginia, those incomes don't seem as high as they do, particularly families with children who, in this part of the country face pretty extraordinary childcare costs, which, cut into your income. So the right way to do this is to say, in my mind, the right way to do this is you would actually not phase the benefit out at all. And then you would have a transparent tax system that clawed those benefits back in the way you felt taxes should be distributed instead of having all these programs phasing in and phasing out, just complicating people's expectations of the system.
So in other words, you make the benefits taxable.
I would, and that would solve a lot of the issue. It's something that a lot of scholars have talked about this. This is not an Elaine Maag original, right? Len Berman has a paper on worker credit that wouldn't phase out. There's been a lot of work by Gene Sterling over the years. Same things. You can make this money up just by taxing it on the back end.
So some critics, of course, have been saying that the credits in the American Rescue Plan, the changes in the credits may be perfectly reasonable, but they have nothing to do with the pandemic. So why make these enhancements now other than the political opportunity presented itself?
My answer to that is child poverty was a problem yesterday. It's a problem today. It's a bigger problem in the pandemic, and it's going to be a problem tomorrow. Just because we have a problem that needed to be solved before the legislation and will need to be solved after the legislation doesn't mean it's a problem we shouldn't give attention to right now as well. And then we've seen, sort of a reversal. We were actually watching child poverty drop before the pandemic hits, and then child poverty starts rising. We also see, a lot of instability, particularly, single moms who now have, with schools not fully open, they're, choosing between work and childcare in many cases. There's some unique moments right now of why we might think about addressing this problem, but it's true. It was a problem yesterday. I wish we had solved it. It's a problem tomorrow. I hope we solve it.
Well, let me ask the question a slightly different way. In a blog you wrote this week, you reminded people that Representative Rosa DeLauro first proposed making child credit fully refundable almost 18 years ago, almost exactly 18 years ago. Democrats controlled Congress and the White House during the Obama administration, but these changes weren't made. What about now? What is it that made this time the time when Congress made this move?
I think those are interesting questions. I'm interested in your thoughts as well, actually. We have a moment right now that's just full of activism that's pointing out, the Black Lives Matter movements, protests, just sustained, showing there is so much harm being done to particular segments of society. We know poverty rates are higher for Black Americans and Hispanic Americans. And maybe that helps bring attention to this. I think also when you see food insecurity rise so much, it's much more likely to be visible to you. In my own community, we think about, the school lunch program usually solves a lot of this food insecurity issues. We send food home to children on the weekends in my children's schools. That's not happening right now. And so it becomes more visible that if we are relying on this piecemeal system, and a holistic approach would likely serve us much better. And absolutely, Representative DeLauro has been, arguing this should be the case from, for 18 years now. And, these political moments don't come up very often. And one happened to come up, and she was determined to get this in the legislation, and she had enough support to do it.
So in a strange way, do you think the fact that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act increased the benefit or made the benefit available to very high income people made it easier for Congress now to make it fully refundable for very low income people?
I do. One of the issues that often comes up is we don't really know how much a child is worth because we subsidize that child in very different ways across different systems. And by combining all the benefits into one, it really made clear how much benefit higher income families were receiving per child than lower income families. This was Jason DeParle pointed it out in the New York Times, and I think his story is dead on. It became extremely visible what was happening at the high end, and folks who advocate for people at the low end of the income spectrum said, we want our share too.
So there's another kind of important or potentially important philosophical change in this bill. And that is that the credits are being made available to families who don't work. Talk a little bit about that. Is this kind of an inflection point in the way government thinks about families with children?
Absolutely. It's a huge change. We have gone through a phase where we believe that, our public policy says families that work are deserving of assistance and people who do not work are undeserving of assistance. And that really does not account for the fact that there are a lot of reasons people might not be able to work. It might be because you have a young child in your home. You might have mental health issues. You might not have the training requisite for the jobs in your area. So there's a lot of reasons people aren't working, but we had sort of just bluntly said, if you're not working, it's your fault and the government will not be picking you up. That's changed. And there's some interesting information out of a very small experiment, admittedly, in Stockton that just came out where they were delivering a cash benefit. It was unconstrained. And at the end of the 2 years, people who had been receiving the benefit were actually working more and more likely to be working full-time jobs. And the rationale given is that if you remove this constant stress from your life of needing to find enough food to feed yourself and just get through your daily life, then you are freed up to use your mental resources to solve other issues, which include finding stable work. I also think, although it's an extraordinary turn, the $3,000 per child doesn't come close to covering the cost of a child. So I don't personally worry that we're going to turn a bunch of people into non-workers. I think there's still an incredible incentive to enter the labor market and work because you need more than $3,000 per child.
So we just have a couple of minutes left. I've gotten several questions in the question and answer box about this. I try to summarize them by this way. There's been growing interest in recent years in taking this trend towards refundable credits kind of another step and creating some sort of basic income for everyone. Uh, there are many variations on the idea. You mentioned our colleague Len Berman has one. There are other ideas. As these credits continue to expand, does it make sense to kind of roll them up into a single benefit?
I think that will depend on whether you fully buy into the, people don't need to work and we should provide some reasonable safety net. A person like myself, I think a floor makes a lot of sense. We live in a society where incomes will always be distributed. There will be some very wealthy people and some very low people, and I think it's very low income people. And I think it's important to define where you think that floor should be, and if the government provides supports to get to that floor, I think that's appropriate. But I understand, that's extraordinarily expensive. It is asking for a redistribution of a scale that we do not see in this country right now. And that would be a real change to go all the way. I think it's easier to argue that parents should be eligible for some sort of basic income because it's not your child's fault what what job you have or whether you're able to work, but your child suffers greatly when they don't have enough resources at hand.
Well, Elaine, I had a whole bunch of other questions I was going to ask you about the earned income credit, but we never got to it. We are out of time. Thank you. This is I keep thinking this is sort of a COVID equivalent of me stopping by your office and getting an education in the CTC. So thank you for taking the time. Thanks to our audience, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks so much. I was thinking the same thing about the office.
Take care, everybody.